provide enough resources and facilities for Buddhism to flourish. It's primarily a lowland phenomenon during this period, but we do get upland forest monk activity. This is also the same in central Thailand as well. It's primarily lowland. Buddhism, for example, in Laos doesn't really get up to the highlands till maybe the 14th century. And finally, I think, is it time to rethink Southeast Asian heritage policies to a certain extent? And also the way we display things in museums. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. I have two quick questions. First of all, on the Laos side of the Mekong, do you see these sites anywhere but except in Vientiane province? And second, about the issue of ethnicity, I take your point that yes, just because they're leaving Mon inscriptions doesn't necessarily mean that they're Mon, but if not, what would they likely have been? Because the Mon have shown themselves to be very, very good at getting assimilated by other people. Right. And historically, it seems to me, if you look at the pattern of where these sites are, it would still make most sense to suggest that they were Mon and then they gradually get absorbed into Thai and Lao. So is there any clear evidence that they weren't Mon, or you're simply saying we can't take for granted that they were?
Yeah, I should have emphasized the examples I was primarily showing today were in Vientiane province, but we do get them. The other main place is Sawanaket right here. So these are the main two clusters. Again, what I argue is that it's primarily the lowland areas where it comes in. And what you see, again, is that, particularly in Sawanaket, that the same here are very similar to the ones on this side. Actually, we get more up into Takek, which would be the next province up. Sorry, it slipped my memory. So yeah, I mean, basically all along this corridor here, we also get same. I think there might be a few right up here as well. I can double check. Michel Larion of the FAO Vientiane has been surveying this part quite extensively. So yeah, I'm pretty sure there's more here as well. So yeah, basically, this region here and here. Your second question, yeah, I take your point. I'm not saying they're not Mon. I think they definitely is Mon there. I just object to the idea that it's completely Mon and that we can read Mon off just not that many inscriptions. Of course, the problem is if it's not just Mon, what other ethnic group is it? And we don't have any other inscriptions, and we can't. It's very hard to read ethnicity off the material record. So yeah, I can't obviously answer that. But yeah.
Hi, I have one question and one comment. I have been interested in very early Buddhism, before Ashoka's time even, in India. And the situation in India was, of course, there was Bimbisara, you mentioned him, but on the whole, there were a number of traders or merchants that endowed the first, that made the first land donations to the Buddha and his Sangha, people like that. And of course, in India, the same problem arose. As you had the monk communities, they needed to be sustained. But is there any evidence in the period that you're covering also of this kind of donations by rich people? That's my question. Okay. The second thing, yes, I agree totally with you about the sacred object versus works of art. It's a real big problem, I think, especially with the kind of Buddhism I've been very involved with, which is the Himalayan Tibetan style Buddhism. It gets so decontextualized in museums. People will just look at a thangka. They have no idea how that thangka would be used by people that are meditating. It's not seen as a flat, solid piece, thing right there. You're meditating in a very different way. So yeah, it's very sad because, there's this whole museum community that doesn't see that aspect of it at all. And it happens a lot with, with that style of Buddhism. But I just quickly, if I may mention, as also, you didn't, of course, talk of UNESCO sites or anything because you weren't involved with that here. But to your point about, yes, if an object is in a museum, it will be preserved. there are World Heritage Sites, even UNESCO's Borobudur, and it's amazing to see people climbing all over the Buddhas and taking pictures and climbing with their shoes on, and I really don't know how well that heritage is being preserved, for instance.
That's another issue, right? Yeah. Your first question, or your question, yeah, I mean, obviously in India, I mean, Himanshu Prabhu Ray has wrote a lot about Buddhism in the Krishna Valley of Andhra Pradesh, and she clearly links it to trade and sponsorship by merchants. So that's, you know, one model we can definitely look at. The evidence in India is quite clear. Unfortunately, in Southeast Asia and definitely where I'm looking at, we don't have clear evidence for it because the inscriptions are quite. There's only one or two other inscriptions that mentions a donor and one, on a Sema stone, and that's he's listed as a Raja Bhiksu, so either a prince who's become a monk or. Yeah, so again, it's probably a member of the royal family that's donating the material. But yeah, again, by trying to emphasize the role of river systems, I am sort of trying to reference that these are trade routes. These are the main trade routes, and I think Buddhism is coming along that. So I think we can infer that that's what's happening, but we haven't got unfortunately not. A lot of things in Southeast Asia we don't have as much as we do in India. Yeah, I mean, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, again, is another issue I don't really want to get into right now, but they're a double-edged sword. I mean, you know, even Angkor right now, the increase in visitorship over the past 5 years alone is really causing serious damage to the temples. I mean, how do you conserve the temples with that amount of foot traffic? So, yeah, there's a lot of. But actually, Angkor has plenty of examples as well of. There's a Vishnu image when you walk in, which is you know, it's the local neck tads, you know, and I think the French tried to move it to the conservatory, and the Cambodians would just not let them touch it. So again, it's, you know, you get it in Cambodia and Burma. It's very interesting.
I was going to ask a question. I'm actually kind of curious and a bit confused.
Yeah.
In these regions, I have not been specifically around here, but I visited as far as, I guess, Cambodia's Preah Vihear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now,
Okay.
Places like that, especially in Cambodia, you know, there's the Hindu temples, which then became Buddhist temples.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you show the pattern along the river, based on my readings, usually these kind of temples or religious places have a bearing much further on. Probably there were sacred sites before, based on the local beliefs,
Okay.
or I don't know in this case how much of Hinduism influences that.
Right.
You know, I'm just a bit curious. Are those spots that you're tracking probably earlier sites that they are repurposing?
Yeah, that's a good question. They're definitely earlier sites. Maybe I didn't emphasize that enough. Yeah, and another interesting question is this contrast between Buddhism and Hinduism. We get both moving into the region. In central Thailand, we get more of a mix in this period. There's certain sites like Nakhon Pathom, Utong, where you get both Buddhism and Hinduism being practiced side by side. Peninsula Thailand, we get a lot of lingas as well. But northeast Thailand, in the lower part, in the Mun, we get a mix. We get Hinduism and Buddhism coexisting, but in the Chi River, we don't get it so much. The sites are definitely, a lot of them were occupied from prehistory. No, it's the wrong one. Sorry. Okay, so we can look here. This is the moat during the Javarvati period, but within it we have an earlier moat. So this is probably the prehistoric Iron Age settlement that then develops further into during this period. Before Buddhism comes into this region, it would probably be animism of some form or another. So the archaeological record, we don't get a whole lot of trace of what those religious beliefs would be. So does that answer your question? Yeah.
I guess another overlay would be fantastic to go back a step further.
Right, right.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Yeah, it's a comment and also ask you a question later. Now, I'm actually a Buddhist from Sri Lanka, and a lot of the Buddhism you find in Thailand, Myanmar, and also to a certain extent in Laos and Cambodia, has also a Sri Lankan connection because the Tripitaka was written in Sri Lanka. I think it was in the 1st century AD. And there was a lot of interaction between Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, where Tripitaka was translated into Burmese, into Thai, and Khmer, and all these languages. So, and then when Sukhothai was set up, the capital of Thailand, it was Sri Lankan architects from Polonnaruwa who came to help in building it so that they would have a separate architecture to that of the Khmer architecture. Now, you haven't mentioned anything about those connections with Sri Lanka.
The Sri Lankan influence comes in later. I mean, so Sukhothai is 13th, 14th century.
Yeah.
The material I'm looking at is 7th to 10th. I'm not saying that, I think there was Sri Lankan influence, but at this period, it's coming in from a variety of places. It's definitely coming in from India. There's a lot of Gupta, Pala influence as well, and southern India. The connections between Sri Lanka and Thailand that you're referring to are much later. I mean, and also in Burma, this is 12th, 13th century. You know, it's well documented that the Thais sent monks to Sri Lanka to be reordained because they were corrupt, and they went to Sri Lanka to bring back a so-called pure form of Buddhism. The earliest scholars have tried to, the earliest redaction of the Pali canon is about 5th century. I mean, it was probably written down earlier than that, but in terms of academic scholarship, I think the earliest date you'll see people saying is 5th.
Yeah, one other question, the comment about the Hindu connection now. I know Buddhism and Hinduism, the practice of it, the living tradition, there's a lot of combinations there. Even the Sri Lankans worship a lot of the Hindu gods. Even many Sri Lankan Buddhists believe that Buddha asked Vishnu to protect Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And a few years ago, when I did a documentary about the spread of Buddhism from India via Sri Lanka to Southeast Asia, and showed what I filmed in Thailand about how they worship Ganesh and Indra and all that. And I mentioned in the narration, this is Brahmic influence in Thai Buddhism. And a Thai professor from Chulalongkorn told me that I was wrong. It's a Western interpretation that they are Buddhist gods, they are not Hindu gods.
I think they start as Hindu gods and get converted into Buddhist gods. But to maybe help to bolster your argument, I mean, I think one of the problems is that Western academia in the past has, a lot of the Buddhist scholarship originally was done by German Protestants who had in the 19th century, who had this very clear idea that religion, as in the West, was clearly definable into different sects. Whereas it's not really the case even today in modern Thailand and so forth. Trying to find the picture of I showed the picture of the forest monk. It's a Brahmin who's conducting the ritual. So, and there's no issue there at all. Oh, here it is. Right. So this is the Brahmin. This is the head Brahmin, and there was 3 other Brahmins, and they conducted the ritual, and it was they'd built a chedi, a stupa, and as the monks were raising the finial on this sort of pulley, the Brahmins, they blew into their conch shells and so forth. So, and even all the royal rituals today in the courts of Thailand are conducted by Brahmins. So there isn't this clear distinction, between Buddhism and Brahmanism, I think the boundaries get blurred. And you clearly see that in the period I'm looking at as well. You see lingas, Shiva lingas, alongside Buddha images and so forth. So yeah, I think it's a fair point.
Okay, I think with that, we probably should go ahead and adjourn for the evening. And before we do that, let's thank Stephen once again for a very interesting discussion.